The Ford Zephyr is a car that was manufactured by Ford of Britain. Between 1951 and 1962 it was sold as a more powerful six-cylinder model to complement the four-cylinder Ford Consul. From 1962 to 1972 the Zephyr itself was offered in both four- and six-cylinder versions, the Consul having been droppped. The Zephyr, and its luxury variants, the Ford Zodiac and Ford Executive, were the largest passenger cars in the British Ford range from 1951 until their replacement by the Consul and Granada models in 1972. History: the Mark I Ford Consul and Zephyr models were first displayed at the Earls Court Motor Show in 1950. They were the first to use in mass production the McPherson strut independent front suspension which is widely used today. Production began with the Consul on January 1, 1951. The Mark I model ran until 1956. From April 1956 the Mark II Consul, Zephyr and Zodiac went on sale and were known as the Three Graces. The Mark II range was popular and finished its run in 1962, when from April that year the Mark III Zephyr 4, Zephyr 6 and Zodiac went on sale. The Consul name was dropped, the car's place in the Ford UK lineup being filled by the first four-cylinder Ford Zephyr. While the Mark II Zephyr and Zodiacs had shared the same body, the new Zodiac and Zephyrs launched in 1962 shared few body panels. With the Mark III, Ford finally sorted out problems that had beset previous models and the Mark III proved to be popular and the most durable of the range. The model sold at a rate equal to or better than the Mark II both in the UK and overseas, but was in production for a shorter time. During the last months of production, an upmarket executive version was added to the Mark III range. The Mk3 range was discontinued in January 1966 and the completely new Zephyr/Zodiac Mark IV range was released in April 1966. This car's design anticipated the later Consul Granada range with V-engines and independent rear suspension, but the development of the model was rushed and this was reflected in its durability. Although the Ford Zephyr never saw American production, a very limited amount were imported into the US and the name itself has appeared on other American Ford-related cars. The first use of the Zephyr name was in 1936 with the Lincoln Zephyr, a smaller companion to the full-sized Lincoln sedans sold at the time, followed in the early 1980s with the Mercury Zephyr, an upscale version of the Ford Fairmont. The Lincoln Zephyr name was resurrected for a new model in 2006 but was changed to Lincoln MKZ the following year. Mark I Zephyr 6 model number EOTA. The first of the Zephyr range was a lengthened version of the four-cylinder 1,508 cc Consul, with a 2,262 cc six-cylinder engine producing 68 bhp. Like the Consul, the Zephyr came with a three-speed gearbox, controlled by a column-mounted lever. The front suspension design, based on that first seen in the Ford Vedette, employed what would later come to be known as McPherson struts, while a more conventional configuration for the rear suspension used a live axle with half-elliptic springs. The car could reach just over 80 miles per hour and 23 mpg. The Ford Zephyr 6 was available with four-door saloon, estate and two-door convertible bodies. The convertible version was made by Carbodies and had a power-operated hood. The estate car was by Abbots of Farnham and was sold as the Farnham. In addition to the main British Ford factory in Dagenham, the Consul and Zephyr were assembled at Ford New Zealand's Seaview factory in Lower Hutt from CKD kits. The large Fords competed with the also locally built Vauxhall Wyvern and Velox and, later the Australian Holden. When the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth II visited New Zealand as part of a Commonwealth tour in the early 1950s, she was pictured watching Zephyrs being built at the local Ford plant. In 1953, a Ford Zephyr 6 driven by Maurice Gatsonides won the Monte Carlo Rally, pushing a Jaguar Mark 7 into second place in the process. 2 years later a Ford Zephyr 6 driven by Vic Preston and DP Maraha won the East African Safari Rally. A saloon tested by the Motor magazine in 1951 had a top speed of 79.8 miles per hour and could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 20.2 seconds. A fuel consumption of 23.7 miles per imperial gallon was recorded. The test car cost £842 including taxes but was fitted with optional leather trim, heater and radio. Zephyr Zodiac model number EOTTA. The Zephyr Zodiac was an upmarket version of the Zephyr launched at the London Motor Show in autumn 1953. It had two-tone paintwork, leather trim, a heater, windscreen washers, white wall tyres, and spotlights. The engine had a higher compression ratio Euro 7.51 instead of 6.81 Euro, increasing the maximum power to 71 bhp. A car tested by the Motor magazine in 1955 had a top speed of 80 miles per hour and could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 20.2 seconds. A fuel consumption of 22.2 miles per imperial gallon was recorded. The test car cost £851 including taxes. There are no official records of Zephyr Zodiac convertibles being produced, but there were a few estate cars. Mark II Zephyr Mark II model number 206E. In 1956 the Consul, Zephyr and Zodiac were all restyled. The six-cylinder car's engines were enlarged to 2,553 cc's, with power output correspondingly raised to 86 bhp. The wheelbase was increased by 3 inches to 107 inches and the width increased to 69 inches. The weight distribution and turning circle were also improved. Top speed increased to 88 miles per hour and the fuel consumption was also improved at 28 mpg. The Zodiac and Zephyr were also offered in two body styles, these being the Highline and Lowline, depending on the year of manufacture Euro, the difference being 1.75 in being cut from the height of the roof panel. The Highline variant featured a hemispherical instrument cluster, whereas the Lowline had a more rectangular panel. As well as a 3-speed manual gearbox, there was an optional overdrive and from 1956 a Borg-Warner DG automatic transmission. At first drum brakes were fitted all round but front discs became optional in 1960 and standard from mid-1961. A two-door convertible version was offered with power-operated hood. Because of the structural weaknesses inherent in the construction of convertibles, few convertibles are known to survive. A convertible with overdrive tested by the Motor magazine in 1961 had a top speed of 88.3 miles per hour and could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 17.0 seconds. A fuel consumption of 24.5 miles per imperial gallon was recorded. The test car cost £1,193 including taxes. Australian production. In Australia, the Mark II Consul, Zephyr and Zodiac were built at Ford Australia's factory in Geelong. Sedan, coupe utility, and station wagon versions were produced. The Australian-developed Mark II station wagon differed from its English estate car counterpart in having a wind-up rear window, and a straight C-pillar, rather than a curved one. A handful of station wagons were registered in 1958, but sales did not really commence until about halfway through 1959. Mark II manufacture continued until 1962, in which year production switched to the assembly of Mark IIIs from imported completely knockdown kits. New Zealand assembly of the Mark II, also from CKD kits, now included the Zodiac. The big Fords from England were now offered alongside the Australian-sourced Ford Falcon and also competed with the Vauxhall Victor and Vaux, Holden, and Australia's Chrysler Valiant. Supplies were restricted due to strict import licensing and demand always exceeded availability. It was not uncommon for buyers to wait 2 to 3 years for their new big Ford. Zodiac Mark II model number 206E. The Mark II Zodiac was slightly altered to distinguish it from the lesser variants, having more elaborate tail-end styling and at the front a different grille. The auxiliary lamps and wing mirrors were deleted from the Zodiac range but it retained two-tone paint, white wall tires, chrome wheel trim embellishes and gold-plated badges. A car tested by the British magazine The Motor in 1956 had a top speed of 87.9 miles per hour and could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 17.1 seconds. A fuel consumption of 21.5 miles per imperial gallon was recorded. The test car cost £968 including taxes. Abbott Estates Mark III Zephyr 4 Mark III Model 211E. In early 1962 Ford replaced the Consul Zodiac range with a dramatically restyled model, although sharing some of its mechanical components, as well as the basic chassis design, with the Mark II models. Rather than continue the Consul name, Ford UK decided to call its replacement Zephyr 4, the 4 indicating that it still used the 4-cylinder 1703cc engine from Consul 375. A 4-speed manual gearbox, now with synchronization all ratios, was standard, with overdrive or automatic transmission available as options. Disc brakes were standard. Zephyr 6 Mark III model numbers 213E, 214E. The Zephyr Mark III shared some of its mechanical components, as well as the basic chassis design, with the Mark II, but had a stronger overall body construction. The exterior was designed by Canadian Roy Brown, who had also designed the Edsel and the Cortina, though the rear of the body was inspired by a design proposal by Frewer. Unlike the Zephyr 4, the Zephyr 6 had a full-width grille including the headlight surrounds. Overall body length and width were the same for both Zephyr 3 versions. With the same 2,553 cc's displacement as before, the Mark III model had higher compression ratio resulting in some 20 horsepower higher output as well as a broader torque range. Only saloons and estate cars were made, the estate being a conversion by Abbots of Farnham. Abbott Estates Zodiac Mark III model numbers 213E, 214E. The Zodiac was an upmarket version of the Zephyr 6, but differed considerably from that model by the limousine-type rear doors, sharper roofline and tail, unique grille, exclusive bumper bars, plusher seating, and upmarket upholstery, dashboard and interior fittings. A choice of individual or bench front seat was available trimmed in leather or cloth. The front doors and bonnet panels were shared with the Zephyr 6. The executive version had extra luxury fittings again. The 2553cc single carburetor 6-cylinder engine was improved internally to increase the power output to 109 bhp, and a new 4-speed all-synchronized transmission with column change was fitted. The brakes, servo-assisted, used discs at the front and drum at the rear. A Mk3 saloon tested by the British The Motor magazine in 1962 had a top speed of 100.7 miles per hour and could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 13.4 seconds. A touring fuel consumption of 22.6 miles per imperial gallon was recorded. The test car cost £1,070 including taxes on the UK market. Ford New Zealand built the Zephyr 4 and 6 as well as the Zodiac locally from CKD kits, offering only the bench front seat option finished in vinyl. Automatic transmission, introduced late in the life of the Mk2, was again available but was a rare factory option as most buyers chose manual. As well as the Zephyr 6 feet, Ford NZ built a 6-cylinder Zephyr Special with a lower equipment level and deletion of the bootlit trim strip and other exterior brightwork, which was sold to fleet operators such as the government. The big Fords were unusual in having 4-speed manual gearboxes when rivals, including Ford's own Falcon, had only 3 speeds. Building the top luxury Zodiac model locally again also gave Ford a supply advantage over key rivals such as Vauxhall, whose upmarket Cresta was only ever sold fully imported and much harder to obtain than the locally assembled Velox. Mark IV Zephyr Mark IV models 3008/3010E. In 1961, Ford began a complete redesign on the Zephyr, under the title of Project Panda. As the car used the new V-Series engines, the then traditional long bonnet concept created a problem until design engineer Harley Kopp required that the car was both larger and had more internal space, and came up with the idea of placing the spare wheel ahead of the radiator on an angle. The result was a vehicle of similar dimensions to the North American Ford Fairlane. The Mk4 range was launched, not at an October Motor Show, but in early 1966 with new V-format engines, the 4 having a 1,996 cc's V4 and the 6 a 2,495 cc's V6 unit. The independent suspension was aided by servo-assisted disc brakes on all wheels. In November 1966 the manufacturers announced a plan to introduce an export special version of the Zephyr Mk4 combining the 3-liter engine of the Zodiac with other specifications largely following those of the existing Zephyr. This 3-liter Zephyr was not offered by Ford on the domestic market. This 3-liter model was quickly adopted by Ford New Zealand, which had originally launched the Mk4 Zephyr assembled locally from CKD kits with the 2.5-liter V6 and received complaints it was underpowered for a country where towing boats and caravans was common. Ford New Zealand also introduced optional floor shift and bucket seats as an alternative to the standard column shift and bench front seat, and a large number of Zephyrs were built in this form, with other modifications, for New Zealand's traffic police. The Zodiac was also again assembled in New Zealand with both bench and bucket front seats. Automatic transmission was optional with both the Zephyr and Zodiac. The local Mark IV line did not include the Zephyr Deluxe version available in the UK, was not as popular as the Mark III and was outsold by the now much wider locally built Australian Falcon range. Production ended in 1972 and the Consul and Granada replacements introduced in the UK were never officially imported into New Zealand. Criticism of the handling of early examples in the UK led to the fitting as standard of radial ply tyres on the larger engined version in place of the more conventional cross-ply tyres with which all versions were shod at the 1966 launch, and the retrofitting of radial ply tyres to early examples addressed the tendency of the rear wheels to slide uncontrollably in wet weather, justifying in the process Ford's investment in a new and relatively sophisticated rear suspension arrangement for the Mark IVs. Even after that, a contemporary nevertheless opined that the ride involved a certain amount of float, and reported that the nose-heavy handling called for a strong driver, a problem which the more expensive Zodiac and executive versions mitigated through the fitting as a standard feature of power-assisted steering. Cost constraints precluded adding power-assisted steering for the Zephyr, but during its production run the steering ratio was lowered, which reduced the strength needed to change direction by increasing the number of turns between locks from 5.5 to an even higher 6.4. Another production modification for the 4-cylinder Zephyr involved redesigning the valve gear in order to eliminate the need on the early MK-IVs for frequent tappet adjustments. The size of the bonnet was emphasized by square-cut styling of the wings. A practical use was found for some of the extra space in front of the driver. The spare wheel was stored, ahead of the engine, under the bonnet, freeing up space at the other end of the car for more luggage. Although large, the car, at least in its Zephyr form, was not particularly luxurious. Individual front seats were available at extra cost, but the standard front bench seat was described by one commentator who ran the car on a long-term test as being intended for people no taller than 5 feet 8 and who have the right leg 3 inches shorter than the left. An estate version of the Zephyr Mark IV was announced just in time for the London Motor Show in October 1966, though deliveries commenced only in January 1967. As with the earlier Zephyrs, volumes did not justify tooling up for estate production at the Dagenham plant, and the cars were instead built by E.D. Abbott Limited of Fulham, based on part-finished saloons received from Ford. The Mark IV Zephyr estates came with black vinyl-covered roof, a fashionable distinguishing feature of upmarket vehicles at the time. Retention unchanged of the saloon's rear light clusters attracted criticism, however, because of the way it narrowed the rear hatch opening at floor level when compared to the arrangements on the cheaper Ford Cortina estates. Zodiac and Executive Mark IV models 3012E/3022E. The Zodiac Mark IV and Executive had 4 headlights and an uprated 2,994 cc's V6 engine. Claimed output was 140 bhp net at 4,750 rpms, with 181.5 lb-ft of torque at 3,000 rpms. The Zodiac featured an alternator instead of a dynamo on the Zephyr, an adjustable steering column, a spare wheel in the engine compartment, a heater and airflow ventilation, electric window washers, 2 speed wipers, a cigar lighter, rev counter, clock, ammeter, and reversing lights as standard. The Zephyr Zodiac Mark IVs with their complex independent rear suspension design represented a considerable step up when compared to the Mark III Big Fords which they replaced. Ford also determined to widen the price gap between the Zephyr and Zodiac version. In January 1967, less than a year after the car's introduction, it was announced that production of the Mark IVs was being cut back in response to poor sales. The announcement was accompanied by several pieces of more upbeat news about Cortina sales, and it was stressed that workers taken off Zephyr Zodiac production would all be redeployed on the Cortina production lines. An estate version of the Zodiac Mk4 was announced at the same time as the Zephyr equivalent, and built alongside it at Farnham. There was no executive estate. The executive was an upmarket version and had the highest specification offered by Ford to UK customers in the 1960s. Automatic transmission along with power steering and a sunroof were standard equipment. Other standard features included fully reclining front seats, walnut fascia, full instrumentation, carpeting throughout, reversing lights, fog lamps, front inertia reel safety belts, and a radio. The Executive was distinguishable from other models by exterior trim and name badges on the front and rear. An automatic transmission Ford Executive was tested by Britain's Autocar magazine in 1967. It had a top speed of 100 miles per hour and could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 13.1 seconds. An overall fuel consumption of 17.2 miles per imperial gallon was recorded. By these performance criteria, the Ford betrayed its weight, but nevertheless usefully bettered the similarly sized 3.3-litre engine Vauxhall Viscount. The Ford's recommended retail price of £1,567 exceeded the £1,483 sticker price on the Viscount. Footnotes References: Alon, Michael. Consul, Zephyr, Zodiac, Executive Fords Mark 1-4. Motorbooks International. ISBN 9780947981426. External links: the Mark I Consul, Zephyr and Zodiac Owners Club, the Ford Zephyr and Zodiac Owners Club of South Australia, the classic BBC TV show Z Cars.